5 of those 14 would not come home, and the men who went in to bring out the rest would dig, by hand, in short shifts around the clock, toward a faint sound of knocking that no one above ground could name, not knowing who was behind the coal, or how many, or whether they were digging toward the living or the dead. There was no explosion, there was no fire, there was no collapse of the earth from some unforeseeable act of nature. There was only water, and the water was never a secret. For days before the wall broke, a collier had watched it weeping out of the coal and had said so, out loud, to the men in charge. The precaution that would have saved 5 lives was known, was available, and was not taken. 14 lives were staked instead on a geological fault that men believed would hold the flood back. It did not reach the boundary. Where they thought there was solid ground, there was 3.5 feet of coal, and behind it a reservoir of black water waiting under enormous pressure. This is the story of the 10 days that followed. It is a story of a corner cut and a warning dismissed, and of a manager who would stand trial for the deaths and walk free. But it is also the story of what that rescue gave to Britain, an honour this country had never before granted, for courage on dry land, and a principle written into the working life of every deep mine that came after. What happened in a flooded pit at Porth changed how a nation rewards bravery and how it guards the men who go underground. Both of those changes are still with us. Neither of them came cheaply. To understand what was lost, you have to first understand the world in which it was cut and hauled and burned. The world of the Rhondda in 1877, at the height of its power and its danger. In the middle decades of the 19th century, the 2 narrow valleys of the Rhondda had become the beating heart of the South Wales steam coal boom. Rhondda Fawr and Rhondda Fash, the Great Valley and the Little One, ran down through the hills of Glamorgan, and where they met stood the town of Porth. The name means gateway, and that is precisely what it was, the mouth of the coalfield, the place through which the wealth of the valleys passed on its way to the sea. Steam coal from these seams was among the finest in the world. It burned hot and clean and left little ash, and it powered the boilers of the Royal Navy and the merchant fleets of an empire that reached around the globe. When a ship left Cardiff or Barry with its holds full, it very often carried coal that had been cut by hand in the darkness beneath Porth. 30 years earlier, these had been quiet green, sparsely peopled valleys, farming country, where a scattering of families worked small holdings on the hillsides. Then the pits came. From the 1850s onward, shafts were sunk one after another, and the whole landscape transformed with astonishing speed. Terraced streets of grey stone houses climbed the valley sides in long parallel rows. Chapels rose among them, and winding engine houses, and the black conical spoil tips that grew year by year against the green. The population multiplied. Men came in from the rural counties of West Wales, from Carmarthenshire and Cardiganshire and Pembrokeshire, leaving the land for the pit because the pit paid, and paid in coin rather than in the uncertain yield of a hillside farm. They brought their language and their faith with them. The Rhondda of 1877 was overwhelmingly Welsh-speaking, and it was overwhelmingly chapel-going. Nonconformist religion shaped the rhythm of the week and the shape of a life. The Sunday services, the prayer meetings, the great tradition of hymn singing that could fill a valley with sound on a still evening. This was not decoration on the surface of these people's lives. It was the frame of everything, and it matters to what follows, because when 14 men and boys found themselves trapped in the dark with the water rising, some of them prayed and some of them sang, and they did it to hold order and to hold hope. And when the worst came, a grieving father would reach not for the language of accident or blame, but for the language of the chapel to speak of his lost son. These were people for whom faith was the natural vocabulary of both endurance and grief. The work itself was hard, close and dangerous in ways that a modern eye can scarcely take in. A collier worked in a low stall, often on his knees or lying on his side, cutting the coal from the seam with a hand pick by the light of an oil safety lamp or a tallow candle carried into the workings. The seams here were the number 2 and number 3 Rhondda seams, and the men who worked them knew the roof and the floor and the smell of their own district as intimately as they knew their own kitchens. They wore flat caps and moleskin trousers. They carried their food and their candles down with them at the start of a shift and came up black at the end of it. The Taff Vale Railway ran the length of the valley, its locomotives hauling the coal away to the docks. And one day, soon those same locomotives would be pressed into service for something no one had planned, standing in the sidings to feed steam to the pumps of a drowning mine. At the centre of this story stands one such pit. Tynewydd Colliery had been sunk in 1852, and by 1877 it was worked by the Rhondda Coal Company. Its manager and part owner was a man named James Thomas. The colliery worked the Rhondda seams, and it did so in a particular and, as it turned out, fatal situation. For Tynewydd sat immediately beside the old workings of another pit, the abandoned Simmer Colliery, disused for years, its underground roadways and stalls long since given up and left to fill slowly and silently with water. That single fact, a live working mine cutting outwards toward an abandoned, water-filled one, is the geographical heart of everything that happened at Porth. Everything else follows from it. You should hold in your mind, too, a small handful of the ordinary people who were part of that working world before the 11th of April, because they are the thread that runs through all that comes after. There was a collier named Charles Oatridge who worked one of the stalls nearest the old Simmer boundary, the man whose place lay closest to the danger, and who, in the days before the disaster, would see something and say something. There was a collier named Thomas Morgan, whose working stall lay on slightly higher ground, and whose son, William Morgan, worked the pit alongside him. There was the Hughes family, a father and 2 sons who went down together to earn together, as families so often did in the valleys. Remember them. Their names will return. To understand how the water came through, you have to understand who was responsible for the ground the men were cutting into, and how decisions about that ground were made. This was an industry driven hard and fast by the enormous rewards of steam coal. The commercial pressure ran always in one direction, outward, forward, into new coal. A company that pushed its workings out quickly won more coal and more profit. And the boundaries between one pit's workings and another's were often the places where that pressure met the greatest risk. Where a live mine approached the abandoned workings of a dead one, the safe course was to know exactly where that old mine's roadways lay, exactly how much water they held, and exactly how thick the wall of solid coal between them really was. But the knowledge that made such caution possible was frequently missing. Accurate abandonment plans of old collieries, the maps that showed where a worked-out pit had actually driven its roadways before it closed, were often poor, incomplete, or simply absent in this era. A mine could be given up and its detailed geography allowed to fade from record within a generation. And so, again and again, decisions about where it was safe to cut leaned not on survey and measurement, but on local geological belief, on what men understood or assumed about the shape of the rock beneath their feet. Oversight existed. The Coal Mines Regulation Act of 1872 governed the industry, and His Majesty's Inspectors of Mines were charged with enforcing it. But the specific and deadly hazard at the centre of this story, the danger of a sudden inrush of water from an abandoned working whose position had been mapped inaccurately, or not at all, was underguarded by the rules of the day. The law had not yet caught up with the danger. That gap between the risk that existed underground and the safeguards written down on paper is the space in which 5 men died at Porth. There is a further, darker resonance to the source of that water, one worth stating plainly and once. The abandoned mine whose flood came through into Tynewydd was Old Simmer Colliery, and Old Simmer had its own history of death. In 1856, an explosion in the simmer workings had killed 114 men and boys, one of the worst disasters the coalfield had yet seen, and the manager charged over it had in the end faced no lasting penalty. The old pit that took 114 lives in 1856 reached back out of the ground 21 years later and very nearly took 14 more. The same water, the same coalfield, the same pattern of a danger known and a caution not taken. Now to the flaw itself and the decisions that turned a known hazard into 5 deaths. The root of it was simple and physical. The miners of Tynewydd were cutting through the coal toward the boundary with old simmer, and between them and the flooded old workings lay only a wall of solid coal. As long as that wall was thick enough, the water stayed where it was. But the men did not know how thick the wall really was, because they did not truly know where the old workings lay. They were working on a belief. The belief was this: running through the ground, roughly parallel to the river, was a geological fault, a break and displacement in the rock that the men referred to as the 7-yard dip fault. It was believed that this fault ran between the 2 collieries and acted as a natural barrier, a wall built by the earth itself, holding the standing water of old simmer safely back from the live workings of Tynewydd. The men were cutting toward the old mine in the confidence that the fault stood between them and the flood, and that they would strike the fault long before they ever struck water. They were wrong, and the manner of their wrongness is the whole tragedy. When the ground was examined after the disaster, the fault that everyone had trusted was found to die out before it reached the boundary. It did not run the whole way. It did not seal the 2 mines from one another, and so, in the place where the water finally broke through, there was no fault at all, only solid coal and not much of it. The barrier that the men believed protected them was, at the fatal point, about 3.5 feet of coal, and behind it a body of water under great pressure. 3.5 feet. That was the margin between an ordinary shift and a disaster that would grip a nation. That is the geology. But geology alone does not kill men. Decisions do, and here the decisions belong to people who can be named. Consider first the warning, because there was a warning, and it was not vague. Charles Oatridge, the collier working the stall nearest the old boundary, had for several days before the 11th of April been seeing water where water should not have been. It was, in his own account, coming out of the coal, seeping and weeping from the face of his working place, in a way that any experienced collier would recognise as wrong. Water in a mine is never a small thing, and water coming out of the coal in a stall that was being driven toward an old flooded working was the plainest kind of danger sign. Oatridge did the right thing. He reported it. Consider next what was done with that warning. The manager, James Thomas, knew that Oatridge was working close to the old simmer workings. That much is not in dispute, and according to the testimony given afterward, Thomas reassured the situation rather than halting it. The understanding conveyed was that Oatridge would reach the fault before he struck the old workings, that the barrier would announce itself in good time. But here is the crux of it, the detail on which the whole question of responsibility turns. Thomas, by the evidence given later, did not warn Oatridge that there was water in the old workings ahead of him. The man cutting toward the danger was allowed to go on cutting, reassured by the belief in the fault, and not told the one fact that would have changed how carefully he worked, that behind the coal lay a drowned mine. Consider, third, the precaution that was available and was not used. When a live mine approaches suspected old workings that may hold water, there is a safe method, and it was known in 1877. You bore ahead of the working face. You drill a slender hole forward into the coal, ahead of where the men are cutting, so that, if you're approaching water, the borehole strikes it first and lets it trickle out under control, giving warning long before the full face of the stall is breached. You survey, you measure, you proceed on knowledge rather than on assumption. At Tynewydd, in the approach to the boundary. That method was not the safeguard the men were relying on. They were relying on the fault, and the fault was not there. That is the shape of the failure. Not a single reckless act, not a moment of obvious madness, but a chain of ordinary decisions, each of which leaned on an unproven belief. The belief that the fault sealed the boundary. The belief that the water Oatridge saw was manageable. The belief that the men would strike the barrier before they struck the flood. The steam coal boom rewarded speed and outward progress, and the tools of certainty, accurate old plans, systematic boring ahead, were either missing or set aside. 14 men were sent to cut coal in a place where the only thing between them and a reservoir of water was a wall whose thickness no one had truly measured. The responsibility for that rested in the eyes of the law that would soon be brought to bear, with James Thomas, the manager and part owner, and with the Tynewydd Coal Company that owned and ran the pit. But responsibility, as this story will show, is one thing. Punishment is another. And the gap between them is where the deepest disquiet of the whole affair still lives. The warnings then were not absent. That is the hardest part to hold. This was not a disaster that arrived out of a clear sky. The water had been seen. It had been reported. A collier had stood in his stall and watched it coming out of the coal and had carried that knowledge to the men above him. What the law of 1872 required in such a case, and what a prudent management would have done regardless of the letter of the law, was to treat that water as the emergency it was, to stop the men, to bore ahead, to establish with certainty how much coal really stood between the living workings and the old flooded ones before another pick stroke fell. None of that happened in time. The work went on, the reassurance held, and the belief in the fault held, right up until the moment the coal could hold no longer. The 11th of April, 1877 was a Wednesday, and it was, by every measure, an ordinary working day. It was not a holiday. It was not a day of full complement, with every man of the colliery underground. It was a normal shift with 14 men and boys spread through the affected districts of the workings, each at his own task, each expecting to finish his stint and climb back up into the daylight of a spring afternoon. That is part of what makes the day so hard to look at squarely. There was nothing to mark it out. No sense of dread hung over the pit head that morning. The men who went down had done the same descent hundreds of times, and every previous time they had come back up. Charles Oatridge was where he always was, cutting in the stall closest to the old simmer boundary, the very place where the water had been weeping from the coal for days. Thomas Morgan was in his stall on the higher ground, a slightly elevated pocket of the workings that would, within hours, become the difference between life and death for the men who happened to be near it. Deeper in the flooded district, below where the water would settle, were others, among them the Hughes father and his sons, working their own places, cutting their own coal, calling to one another in Welsh across the dark, as men did to keep company through a long shift. Think of what that afternoon held for each of them without their knowing it. A boy of 13 named Robert Rogers was at work in the pit that day, one of the youngest underground. Edward Williams, a man of 35, was at his place. William Morgan, 28 years old, was among the men near the higher ground. John Hughes, aged 50, worked with his sons, one of them a lad not yet out of his teens, and another younger still, a boy of about 15. These were not statistics. They were a cross-section of the valley itself. The old hand of 50 and the boy of 13, fathers and sons in the same stalls, the whole chain of a mining family present in a single district of a single pit on a single ordinary Wednesday. The afternoon wore on toward the change of shift. The lamps burned, the picks fell, and somewhere behind the coal in Oatridge's stall, the pressure of a drowned mine leaned against 3.5 feet of solid coal, and found it, at last, not enough. At about 4 o'clock, the wall gave way. It did not fail slowly. When the coal broke, it broke all at once, and the water behind it came through with a violence that is difficult to convey. The breach opened through the centre of the stall where Oatridge had been working, the exact place the warning water had been seeping from, and it tore out a gap roughly 5 feet wide. Ahead of the flood, it drove the block of coal that had been the barrier, that measured 3.5 feet of rock that everyone had believed was solid ground with a fault beyond it. There was no fault. There was only the gap now, and through it came the accumulated water of old simmer, released in an instant. The flood raced through the low workings. It followed the roadways and the stalls, filling the deep places first, rising through the district faster than a man could climb away from it. In those first minutes, the 14 were cut apart from one another, sealed into separate pockets by the water and by the trapped air that the flood pushed ahead of it. Some found themselves cut off with a space of air above the rising water. Some did not. 4 of the 14 were overwhelmed by the floodwater in those first minutes. John Hughes, aged 50, his son William Hughes, 17 or 18 years old, Edward Williams, 35, and Robert Rogers, the boy of 13. They died in the inrush, in the district where they had been working, before any rescue could begin. That is the plain fact of it, stated once, as it must be. 4 lives ended in the first minutes of the flood. Above ground the alarm went up almost at once. Water was pouring into the workings, and men were unaccounted for, and the ordinary afternoon became, in the space of minutes, an emergency that would draw in the whole valley, and then the whole country. But underground, in the dark that the flood had made, something else was happening that no one above yet knew. Not all 14 had been overtaken. 2 separate groups of men had found air and had found ground high enough to keep them above the water, at least for now. One group had reached Thomas Morgan's stall on the higher ground, 5 men who had scrambled to the one place in their district where the water could not immediately follow. And deeper in, below the level the water had risen to, a second group was cut off entirely, sealed behind the flood in a pocket of air, alive and utterly beyond reach of any voice from above. For those men, the ordeal was only beginning, and for the men above ground, the terrible arithmetic was already clear. 14 had gone down, some were surely dead, some might be alive, and there was no way to know which or how many or where, nothing but water and coal and the silence beneath it. The response began within the hour, and it began with the only thing that could be done: pumping. To reach any man still alive behind the flood, the water had to be brought down, and to bring the water down meant pumps, and pumps meant steam, and steam meant boilers and coal and men to work them without pause. What started as the effort of a single colliery grew over the days that followed into something the like of which the coalfield had not seen, a national rescue, watched and reported and prayed over across the whole of Britain. Heavy pumps were brought to the pit, an additional boiler was installed to raise more steam, and when the demand for steam outran what the colliery itself could supply, the Taff Vale Railway ran its locomotives into position and used the engines that hauled coal down the valley to feed steam to the pumps of the drowning mine. Every resource the valley possessed was turned toward the water, but pumping alone was slow, and the men behind the coal did not have the luxury of slow. So alongside the pumps, the rescuers did the other thing, the harder thing. They cut. They drove headings through the solid coal toward where they believed trapped men might be, hewing by hand through the same seams. The trapped men had been working, racing the exhaustion of their own bodies against the failing strength of the men they were trying to reach. They worked in short shifts to keep fresh arms at the face around the clock, the work organised, by the documented accounts, into 4 spells of 3 hours each, turning day and night without stop. Colliers from Tynewydd and from the pits all around came to take their turn at the coal. This was the kinship of the pit made visible, men who would not leave other men behind the coal, cutting toward them hour after hour, not knowing whom they would find. The first men they reached were the 5 in Thomas Morgan's stall on the higher ground. As the rescuers cut through the final wall of coal separating them from that group, they came up against the same physics that had caused the disaster in the first place: trapped air under pressure. Behind the last of the coal, the air in the men's pocket had been compressed, and when the rescuers broke through, that compressed air blasted out through the opening. In that instant, William Morgan, 28 years old, was killed by the force of the released air, one of the very men the rescuers had cut through the earth to save, lost at the moment of reaching him. The other 4 in that group came out alive. It was a cruel outcome, and it carried a private grief within it, because among those who felt William Morgan's death most keenly was Thomas Morgan, whose stall had been the refuge, and who spoke afterward of his lost kin, not in the language of blame, but in the language of the chapel that had shaped his whole life. That he had passed the river of Jordan on the holy hill to the better land. It is the voice of a bereaved father reaching for the only words large enough to hold what had happened, and it belongs to him. 5 men had now been accounted for, 4 brought out alive, 1 lost at the moment of rescue. 4 others were known to have died in the first inrush. That left the arithmetic hanging over the whole operation. 9 men had been saved or confirmed. 5, and here the counting faltered, because no one above ground yet knew the fate of the men sealed in the deeper pocket, below the waterline, whom no rescuer had reached and no voice had answered. Then came the knocking. From somewhere below the water, deep in the flooded district, the rescuers heard sound. A knocking, faint and deliberate, coal struck against coal in the old signal of men underground, telling the world above that they still lived. Someone was alive down there, but who and how many and how far behind the flood, no one could say. The knocking told them only that the digging must go on, and go on toward a target they could not see. Through coal they had to measure yard by yard. The heading toward the trapped men was driven through roughly 38 yards of solid coal. 38 yards, cut by hand by exhausted men in 3-hour shifts, while an entire nation followed the bulletins. For this had become a national event in a way that would have been impossible only a generation earlier. The electric telegraph carried news of Porth out of the valley and across the country in near real time, and the newspapers printed each day's progress, and crowds gathered at the pit head and in the streets of the town, and the watching reached to the very top. Queen Victoria herself followed the rescue, sending telegrams to ask after the fate of the men, the sovereign of an empire waiting, like everyone else, on word from a flooded pit in the Rhondda. The whole country, up to the Queen, was watching men dig toward a sound in the dark. An attempt was made to reach the trapped men another way as well. 2 deep-sea divers were brought up from London, men trained to work in the flooded roadways where colliers could not go, and they went down into the drowned workings to try to reach the men through the water itself. But the flooded roads defeated them, the currents, the debris, the collapsed and broken ground of a mine that had been torn apart by the inrush. The divers could not get through. It would come down, in the end, to the coal and to the men cutting it. Day after day the heading advanced. The trapped men behind their wall had nothing. They had no food but what they had carried down for a single shift, long since gone. They had no fresh light once their candles were spent. What they had was water, the mine water around them, the very flood that had trapped them, which they drank to stay alive. And by one account they had the grease and tallow of their own candles, which they ate. And they had, by the accounts that came down afterward, one another, and their voices, and their faith. It is said that the oldest man among them led the others in hymn singing to hold off despair, filling that sealed pocket of the earth with the sound that filled the chapels of the valley on a Sunday. Men singing in the dark, below the water, waiting for a knocking to be answered. The rescuers heard them too through the coal, and heard words come through it. "We are starving," the men called. "Oh, make haste. It is a line that carries the whole of those days in it, the hunger, the endurance, the desperate nearness of rescue, and the terrible slowness of it. Make haste. And on the other side of the coal, men made all the haste that human arms could make, and it was still measured in yards and in days. On the morning of Friday the 20th of April, the heading was close. The rescuers cutting at the face could hear the trapped men more clearly now, close enough to speak through the thinning coal, close enough that the men on the far side could guide the picks. A voice came through the coal. A little to the right, the trapped men called, telling the rescuers where to cut, spoken in Welsh from the far side of the last wall. Men who had been sealed in the dark for the better part of 10 days were steering their own rescue by sound, adjusting the aim of the men digging toward them, inch by inch. And then at about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the last of the coal came away. The final partition broke, and the rescuers were through. Behind it were the men, 4 men and a boy, alive, after 9 days trapped underground, 10 days from the moment the water first broke in. They were too weak to stand. They had lived on mine water, and on the grease of their candles, and on the will to endure, and now, at the moment of release, the men who had cut through 38 yards of coal to reach them lifted them out. At the instant of the breakthrough, an exchange passed between the two sides of the coal that has come down through every account of that day. "Where is the lad?" one of the rescuers asked, meaning the boy, the youngest of the trapped, a lad of about 15. And from the far side came the answer, from a man named George Jenkins. "In my arms." The boy had been held and kept and carried through the worst of it by the men trapped with him, and now he was passed out through the gap in the coal into the daylight of the world above. That boy was David Hughes. He was about 15 years old, and he had survived, but the flood that trapped him had already taken from him more than he yet knew, for David Hughes was one of the Hughes family who had gone down together, and while he had lived through the 9 days behind the coal, his father, John Hughes, and his brother, William Hughes, had been among the 4 overwhelmed in the first minutes of the inrush. He was carried out alive into a valley that had prayed for him, and he was carried out by the accounts of the day, not yet knowing that he had been made fatherless and brotherless by the same water that had spared him. There is no way to speak of that gently. A boy came up alive, and grief was waiting for him at the surface, but the surface on that Friday afternoon was overwhelmingly a place of deliverance. 5 men and a boy had been believed lost and were now found. Word ran through the crowd at the pit head and out along the telegraph wires, and a nation that had waited 10 days for an answer received it. 9 of the 14 had been saved. 5 families were bereaved, and their grief was real and would not lift. But 9 men who'd been given up for dead in the first hours were alive, and that fact, the 9 saved against every expectation, is what made Porth in the spring of 1877 not only a disaster but a deliverance that the whole country had witnessed together. And then, as the crowds thinned and the pumps at last fell silent, and the dead were carried home to their chapels, the questions began. Because 9 men saved did not answer the harder question. 5 men were dead, and the water that killed them had not come from nowhere. It had been seen, it had been reported, and someone would have to account for why the men had been cutting toward a drowned mine with only 3.5 feet of coal between them and the flood. The inquest opened at Porth, before the coroner for Glamorgan, into the deaths of the 5 who had died: John Hughes, Edward Williams, Robert Rogers, William Morgan, and a 5th man recorded as J. Jones, otherwise Hughes. It was the coroner's task to establish how these men had come by their deaths, and the inquiry into that question went down into the workings, quite literally, to find its answer. What the investigation established is the heart of the accountability. The breach point was examined and the gap measured, the 5-foot opening through the centre of Oatridge's stall. The barrier of coal that had failed was measured and found to have been about 3.5 feet thick at the point of the breakthrough. And most damning of all, the fault, the 7-yard dip fault, the geological barrier, on which the whole safety of the district had been staked, was traced and found to die out before it reached the boundary between the two collieries. There had been, in truth, no reliable barrier at all in the place where it mattered. The men had been cutting toward a flooded mine in the belief that the earth itself sealed them off from it, and the earth had done no such thing. The inquest jury returned a verdict of accidental death, but the matter did not end there, because the finding of accidental death for the men who died did not settle the question of whether someone had been responsible for the conditions that killed them, and so the law turned to the man in charge. On Monday the 6th of August, 1877, James Thomas, the manager and part owner of Tynewydd Colliery, was placed on trial for manslaughter at Swansea Assizes before Baron Cleasby. The trial ran for the better part of 2 days, and it turned on precisely the questions this whole story turns on. Was it known that there was water in the old simmer workings, and could the 7-yard dip fault reasonably have been relied upon as a safe barrier against that water? The prosecution's case rested on the argument that the danger had been known, or ought to have been known, and that reliance on the fault had been a reckless substitute for the precautions that would have kept the men safe. The defence rested on the argument that James Thomas had genuinely and honestly believed the fault sealed off the old pit, that he had acted on the best geological understanding available to him, and that a sincere and widely shared belief, even a mistaken one, was not the same thing as criminal negligence. The evidence of the water was laid before the court. The reports Oatridge had made that there had been a great deal of water in his working place, that the water was coming out of the coal in the days before the disaster, were set against Thomas's understanding that Oatridge would reach the fault before he struck the old workings, and against the account that Thomas had not told him there was water in the old workings ahead. That pairing, the warning given and the warning not fully answered, was the crux of the case, the place where the whole question of guilt and innocence came to rest. The jury weighed it, and the jury would not convict. The accounts of exactly how that came about do not entirely agree. By some accounts, the jury deliberated only briefly, a matter of some 45 minutes, and could not agree on a verdict, and James Thomas was discharged and bound over on a surety of £200, with the possibility of a further trial that in the end never brought a conviction. By other accounts, he was simply acquitted outright, on the ground that he had honestly believed the fault protected the men. The mechanism differs from telling to telling. The outcome does not. No jury would convict him. He walked free. Whatever the precise route, the man in charge of a pit where 5 men and boys had died in a flood that had been seen and reported before it came, faced no punishment for it. And here is the deeper and more uncomfortable truth that the trial exposed, the thing that sits beneath the verdict. The failure at Tynewydd was not, in the end, a single, reckless act that a jury could point to and condemn. It was something more diffuse and more systemic than that. It was reliance on an unverified geological assumption. It was the failure to treat reported water as the emergency it was. It was the whole industry's habit of leaning on belief where it should have leaned on survey and measurement and boring ahead. A courtroom is built to punish a guilty man. It is not well built to punish a guilty practice, a way of working that everyone accepted, that the law itself had not yet forbidden, and that had killed men not through one person's malice, but through a shared and comfortable confidence in a fault that turned out not to be there. That is why the verdict at Swansea, however it was reached, could never be the end of the story. If the law as it stood could not convict the man, then the law as it stood was not enough. And the true reckoning for Tynewydd would come not in a courtroom, but in the slow, grinding change of how Britain governed the mines that fed its empire. The change that made sure that what happened at Porth would be harder to repeat, because the danger the disaster exposed was not peculiar to Tynewydd. Across the coalfields of Britain, live mines were working outward toward the abandoned workings of dead ones, and the plans of those old workings were, again and again, inaccurate, or incomplete, or lost. The barrier of coal left between an old flooded pit and a live one was again and again a matter of belief rather than measurement. Tynewydd had made that danger visible to the whole nation in the most gripping way imaginable. 10 days of national suspense, the Queen's own telegrams, 5 dead and 9 saved, and it sharpened a concern that had been building in the industry into something that demanded an answer in law. The Coal Mines Regulation Act of 1872, under which the industry had been operating, was in the years that followed strengthened and eventually succeeded by the Act of 1887, and the direction of that change ran straight through the ground at Porth. The expectations placed on colliery managers around abandoned workings tightened. The keeping of accurate abandonment plans, the maps that showed where a worked-out pit had actually driven before it closed, became a matter of far greater seriousness, because Tynewydd had shown in the plainest possible terms what happened when those plans were wrong or missing. And the practice of boring ahead when approaching suspected old workings, drilling forward into the coal ahead of the men, so that a slender borehole strikes any hidden water first and lets it out under control long before the working face is breached, moved from being one option among several toward being the settled, expected discipline of the trade. That principle is the true and lasting legacy of the 5 men who died. You survey, you bore ahead of the face toward any suspected old working. You never ever rely on assumption where standing water may lie. It sounds almost too simple to have needed 5 deaths to establish, but it was precisely the assumption, the confidence in a fault that was not there, that had killed them, and the reform hardwired into British mining, the refusal to make that assumption ever again. For the entire remaining life of the deep mining industry in this country, wherever men drove workings toward old flooded ground, that discipline stood between them and the fate of Tynewydd. It is impossible to count the lives it saved, because the disasters it prevented never happened. But they are real, those uncounted men who went home to their families across the decades because the coal ahead of them had been bored and tested rather than trusted. They are the quiet dividend of Porth. That was the reform. But Tynewydd left the country something else as well, something that had nothing to do with pumps or plans or acts of parliament, and everything to do with how a nation chooses to honour courage. Consider what the rescuers had actually done. For 10 days, ordinary colliers had gone down into a flooded, broken pit to cut by hand toward a sound in the dark, not knowing whom they would find, working in 3-hour shifts through danger that had already killed one of the trapped men at the moment of breakthrough. They had earned recognition of the highest kind, but in 1877, Britain had no established way of giving it to them. The nation's highest honour for saving life, the Albert Medal, instituted in 1866, existed, but it had until that moment been awarded only for gallantry at sea, for those who risk themselves to save others from shipwreck and drowning on the water. There was, quite simply, no equivalent recognition for a man who risked his life to save another on land. Tynewydd changed that. The scale and the drama and the sheer visible heroism of the rescue, witnessed as no rescue had ever been witnessed before by a whole country following the telegraph, made the absence impossible to sustain. And so Queen Victoria approved the award of the Albert Medal for the Tynewydd rescuers, and in doing so extended it, for the first time in its history, to gallantry on land. 4 Albert Medals of the first class were granted, and 21 of the second class, the largest award of its kind that had ever been made, and the founding moment of land gallantry recognition in this country. Every civilian act of courage on dry land that the British state has formally honoured since traces its origin to that decision, made because of what happened in a flooded pit at Porth. The lineage that would in time run onward toward the George Cross begins here, in the Rhondda, in the spring of 1877. The men who received the 4 first-class medals were not generals or officials, but working colliers and the engineers who had directed the fight against the water. Isaac Pride, a collier, was among them. the man who, by the accounts of the day, led the final breakthrough in near darkness, and who, it was said, bridged the floodwater with his own body so that others could pass. John Howell, a collier, received the first-class medal. Daniel Thomas, a colliery proprietor, received it, and William Byth, the engineer who had directed the mechanical side of the rescue, the pumps and the boilers and the steam, received it. 21 more men received the second class. It was, in the truest sense, an honour given to the pit, to the kinship of colliers who would not leave other men behind the coal. There was a medical honour born at Porth as well. Among the men who went down into the workings during the rescue was a local doctor, Henry Naunton Davies, a man who had himself spent 16 years underground as a miner before he ever became a physician, and who was a magistrate in the district besides. He did not direct the rescue from the surface. He went down into it, into the flooded and dangerous workings, to tend the men. For that, Henry Naunton Davies received the first gold medal ever awarded by the British Medical Association, a founding moment for that honour, and a recognition that the courage shown at Porth had not been the colliers alone. And yet, even in the giving of honours, the shadow of accountability that runs through this whole story found its way in. Not every man who deserved recognition received it. There was a rescuer named Abraham Dodd, whose work in the pit had, by the accounts of others, been outstanding. A man who had dragged survivors clear, who had been among the bravest at the face. But Abraham Dodd had spoken out. He had publicly criticised the mine owners, and after he had done so, his name was left off the list of those who received the medal. The man who told an uncomfortable truth about the men who ran the pit was quietly excluded from the honours that his courage had earned. It is a small detail against the scale of the whole affair, and it is easy to pass over. But it belongs in the story, because it rhymes with everything else in it, with the warning that was not fully answered, with the manager who walked free, with an industry more comfortable rewarding courage than confronting the failures that had made the courage necessary in the first place. When the men were safely out and the pumps at last silenced, the valley did what the valley knew how to do. It gathered. The gratitude of the Rhondda for the rescuers was enormous, and it found expression in a great public gathering above Pontypridd at the ancient site known as the Rocking Stone, Y Maen Chwith, a place that had long been used for the largest assemblies of the district. There, to honour the men who had gone into the flooded pit, a crowd gathered that heritage accounts number in the tens of thousands. By some reckonings, as many as 40,000 people come together on the hillside to witness the recognition of the rescuers. Set that number against the story. 40,000 people gathered to say thank you to a handful of colliers who had cut through 38 yards of coal toward a knocking in the dark. The scale of the gratitude matched the scale of the fear that had gripped the country through those 10 days. Alongside the medals came presentation silverware and testimonials, the tangible tokens of a nation's relief, distributed to the men who had made the rescue. These were not wealthy men. For a collier of the Rhondda, a piece of engraved silver from a grateful public was an heirloom, a thing to be kept and passed down, proof that a father or a grandfather had been one of the men who went in at Tynewydd. And it is largely through those kept objects that the story survives in a form you can still stand in front of today. For the colliery itself is long gone. The winding gear came down, the shaft was capped, the terraced streets and the chapels remain, but the pit that stood at the centre of them has vanished. And the scarred industrial landscape of the Rhondda has, over the decades since the last coal was drawn, been largely reclaimed by green. Porth today is a valley town like others in the Rhondda, its mining past written into its street names and its chapels and its memory rather than into any working headgear. A visitor passing through would find little on the ground to mark the place where the whole of Britain once held its breath for 10 days. But the objects endure, and they are kept with care. 5 of the Albert medals awarded for the Tynewydd rescue, together with presentation silverware from those days, are held in the collections of the National Museum of Wales and are shown at Big Pit, the National Coal Museum, itself a former colliery preserved so that the world above ground might understand the world below it. There, the medals that Britain struck for the first time for gallantry on land sit as physical proof of what the disaster gave and what it cost. The honour born of the rescue, held in trust in the country whose mining families both suffered and saved. The story is a fixture of that museum's telling of the coalfield, kept alive and taught, so that the men of Tynewydd, the dead and the saved, and the rescuers alike, are not forgotten in the valley that made them, and that keeping matters because a story like this one can go 2 ways in a nation's memory. It can be smoothed into a simple tale of heroism, the 10 days of suspense and the miracle of the 9 saved, the medals and the crowds, and the Queen's telegrams, a story with a happy ending, filed under courage. Or it can be remembered whole, with the cost left in and the cause left in, the 3.5 feet of coal, the water that was seen and reported, the fault that was trusted and was not there, the manager who walked free, the rescuer struck off the list for telling the truth. The Rhondda and the museum that guards its history have chosen to remember it whole. That is the harder and the more honest choice, and it is the right one. What became of the men who came up out of that pit is its own quiet coda to the 10 days. They did not walk out whole. 9 days sealed behind the coal, drinking mine water in the dark, had left them so weakened that they could not stand when the last partition broke, and beyond mere exhaustion and exposure, they suffered the effects that men who have been held under pressure and then released too quickly suffer, what the divers of the age were beginning to call the bends, the sickness of decompression, as their bodies adjusted to the ordinary air of the surface. They were carried, not led, into the daylight, but they recovered. The survivors of Tynewydd lived, the 4 men and the boy of the final group, and the 4 who had come out of Thomas Morgan's stall before them, and they carried the valley's most extraordinary experience in their bodies and their memories for the rest of their lives. The boy came to stand, in a way, for the whole of it. David Hughes, about 15 years old, carried out in George Jenkins' arms, was photographed afterward, a lad who had been to the bottom of the worst thing the coalfield could do and come back from it. His was the face of survival, and yet his was also the face of the cost, because the same flood that had carried him into that photograph had taken his father and his brother, and no medal and no crowd of 40,000 could give those back to him. He is the story in a single life. Deliverance and bereavement arriving in the same boy on the same afternoon, from the same water, and the man whose warning stands at the head of it all lived too. Charles Oatridge, the collier who had watched the water weeping from the coal in his stall and had said so, day after day, before the wall gave way, Oatridge survived the disaster that broke through the very place where he had been working. He carried out of it something heavier than an honour, the knowledge that he had seen the thing coming and had named it and had not been able to make it enough. The breach opened through the centre of the stall where he had cut. He lived to give his account of the water to the inquest and to the court, and his account was the truest measure the law ever took of what had gone wrong beneath Porth. The plain testimony of a working man that the danger had been visible and had been spoken of before it ever arrived. Between them, those 2 men hold the whole of it, the one who saw the water and the boy who survived it, the warning that went unanswered and the life that was spared, and around them the 5 who did not come up, the man of 50 and the boy of 13, the 2 who died in the first minutes, and the one lost at the very instant of rescue, and the 5th whose name the record itself struggled to fix. 9 saved, 5 lost, 10 days that a nation could not look away from. At about 4 o'clock on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon, 14 men and boys were cutting coal at Porth, and behind the wall in front of them lay a drowned mine that everyone had believed was safely held back. It was not held back by war or by earthquake, or by any hand that could not have been stayed. It was held back by 3.5 feet of coal and by a belief in a fault that was never where the men thought it was. The water had been seen, it had been reported, and still they cut toward it. For that, 5 families in the Rhondda were emptied, and no jury would name the reason a crime. But the country that watched those 10 days did not come away with nothing. It came away having learned to bore ahead of the coal, and never again to trust the ground on faith. A discipline that carried unnumbered men home to their families across the whole life of the mines that came after. And it came away having decided, for the first time in its history, that courage on dry land was worthy of its highest honour, so that every act of civilian bravery this nation has formally recognised since begins in a flooded pit at Porth in the spring of 1877. That is what remains, the medals kept behind glass in a valley that guards its own memory, the rule written into the working life of every deep mine, and the sound that a nation once held its breath to hear answered, a faint knocking, deep in the dark, from men who are still alive and who are counting on the coal being cut in time.